Are we ready? Terrific. Good evening to you. Welcome. I'm Karen Tucker, CEO at the Churchill Club. This is a very special occasion tonight as we welcome EPA Administrator Lisa P. Jackson and former Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm. She's also host of CurrentTV's The War Room with Jennifer Granholm. Lisa and Jennifer, thank you so much for being with us tonight. We really appreciate it. And yes. And I'd also like to thank Microsoft for hosting this program. Thank you so much. And another thank you to the representatives from Zoe Lofgren's office for joining us tonight. Thank you for being here. A brief introduction for our new guests in the audience. Churchill Club is the top independent nonprofit forum for business and technology discussions in the Bay Area, now in our 28th year. And what drives us every day is to encourage innovation, economic growth, and societal benefit. And we do that through the up to 40 programs that we convene every year, where like minds can learn and connect with one another. Our next program is next week on January 16th. It's called Will Tech Power the Next Jobs Boom? With a rockstar panel of economists, including Hal Varian of Google and Michael Chewy of McKinsey Global Institute. This will be in San Francisco on January 23rd. Also in San Francisco, we're going to look at trends in privacy to help move the needle on consumer privacy protection, while also supporting innovation and economic growth at the same time. And then on January 30, we're taking a look at software-defined networking. Is this going to be the next networking revolution? And then on February 7, we present LiveOps Chairman Maynard Webb in conversation with eBay CEO John Donahoe, and they're going to discuss a new era for work. So we hope you'll join us for at least some of these great programs. If you're tweeting, please use the hashtag Churchill Club, and you'll find other Twitter codes in your printed program. For the audience Q&A tonight, we will make index cards available throughout the presentation, and we're going to ask you to write your questions down, along with your name and affiliation as applicable, and articulate your questions on one of the cards. And when you're ready for our team here to pick your card up, simply just hold your card in the air and they'll collect it from you. So let me now call up Rob Bernard, Chief Environmental Strategist at Microsoft, to introduce our speakers. Under Rob's watch at Microsoft, by the way, the company is on the path to become carbon neutral across internal operations in more than 100 countries. So he now has a carbon fee for divisions inside of the company, and each has to offset its own carbon emissions associated with things like data centers and software development labs, etc. And earlier this year, Microsoft was recognized by the EPA as the third largest purchaser of green power in the U.S. Well done, Rob. Let's welcome Rob Bernard.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, everybody, for coming out to our campus. We're thrilled to partner with Karen and the Churchill Club, and it's my real pleasure to be providing introductions tonight to two people who I've admired for many, many years, even before I had my role as Chief Environmental Strategist. Our guest of honor is Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Lisa Jackson, where since 2009 she has led EPA's efforts and a staff of more than 18,000 people to protect health and environment for all Americans. Since being named President Obama's cabinet member in charge of environmental protection, Lisa has been named one of Newsweek's most important people in 2010, featured on Time Magazine's 2010 and 2011 lists of the 100 most influential people in the world, listed in Essence Magazine's 40 Women Who Have Influenced the World, and profiled in O Magazine for her work to protect our nation's air, water, and land. She has made transparency and open dialogue on what it means to be environmentally responsible a priority at every level. The program tonight is just one more example of this. Lisa announced, as many of you know, over the holidays, that she'll be moving on from her post later this month. Yet she's still come out to talk to people right up to the very end of her tenure, and I think that speaks very well to her commitment to transparency. We're looking forward to hearing her latest insights and perspectives, where she thinks this community ought to focus its efforts to speed innovation and economic gains, and maybe what comes next for her. Here to lead the conversation with Lisa is Jennifer Granholm, former two-term governor of Michigan and a distinguished practitioner of law and public policy at UC Berkeley. As governor, Jennifer led the state through a brutal economic downturn that resulted from a meltdown in automotive and manufacturing sectors. She worked to diversify the state's economy, strengthen its auto industry, preserve the manufacturing sector, and add new emerging sectors such as clean energy to Michigan's economic portfolio. During her tenure, she has pioneered clean energy policies by working with business and labor, Republicans and Democrats, to create new economic opportunities in Michigan. Her leadership attracted more than 89,000 jobs and $9.4 billion in clean energy investments to Michigan. We are privileged to have her here as our interviewer. Please give your warmest Churchill Club welcome to Lisa Jackson and Jennifer Granholm.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to you all for coming, and thank you, Rod, and thank you. I'm going to call her Lisa because she's a girlfriend of mine. So, and she's going to call me Jennifer, and you guys can do the same. We give you permission to be able to address us first names, if that matters to anybody. I want to start, Lisa, with the question that Rob was suggesting that everybody here wants to know, which is, now that you are leaving, what is next for you?
Okay. Well, I don't know.
Come on. Don't believe that.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, EPA does, the Environmental Protection Agency does, we're a regulator of many, many industries. And so for ethical reasons, one of the things I've said to people when I hire them is that you should never think about what you're going to do next, because I really believe it changes how you approach the job as you're sitting in it. And so one of the reasons for wanting to move on right now is that I do need the time and space to think about what next. I know it'll be something to do with the environment and sustainability and clean energy and furtherance of the president's goals around that, but where to do that and how, it's just a little too soon to tell.
So obviously for a lot of reasons you can't make any commitments to anybody while you're still in the job. But in terms of what pulls you personally, is it more academic or private sector? What do you have a natural pull toward one or the other?
I think, and we're going to talk about this a lot tonight, that the private sector is a key place for us to be looking right now. One of the frustrations for those of us who've lived inside the Beltway, and I have to acknowledge my Chief of Staff is here, my Deputy Chief of Staff, Diane Thompson, Jose Lozano, thank you for coming. And another thanks to Rob for hosting us in this amazing facility, and Churchill Club. Karen, thank you. I think we are all feeling that one of the frustrations has been, we know there are companies and leaders like a Rob Bernard, like a Microsoft out there doing amazing things. EPA recognizes your leadership and Microsoft's leadership, but how do we turn that into an engine for policy reform so that you're not feeling like you're either disadvantaged or not particularly advantaged? And so I think that's intriguing. But, there's always, academia is great. I have a master's degree, and the other thing I know I'm going to do is spend more time with my own kids, because they're getting up and out of the way. So,
well, she's a scientist, she has her master's in chemical engineering from Princeton.
I do.
So she's a real scientist. I'm a political scientist, so I get totally discounted. But let's talk about the private sector. We've had this conversation, Lisa and I have, and I'm sure you all, in observing what has gone on or what has not gone on in Washington, D.C., you realize that there is an opportunity for the private sector to lead in some way, shape, or form where government has not been able to. I was having a discussion with my kids the other day, and they said, Mom, why would we want to go into government? It is a dinosaur. It is irrelevant. The action is in the private sector, even on pushing for policy initiatives. curious about your reaction to that. Is government obsolete?
No. But before I answer, how many people think maybe it is? I'm just curious.
All right, let me ask it differently. How many of you would rate Congress above cockroaches, which is the poll that was out today? I'm not kidding you. All right, a couple of you have some faith, but no other hands went up. Anyway.
I think that government is incredibly important. In the world that I live in environmentalism, and I do consider myself an environmentalist. I'm going to look out at all of you, not just you, Jennifer.
Of course.
But, you know, I came up at an environmental protection agency in a time where we were the world leaders in deciding what protection meant, whether it was what the standards in clean air are, and we're in a state that was always a leader in our country. I think what we're seeing now, one of the big trends and one of the big innovations is that many companies are seeing the ability to go far beyond any floor that government sets for it. So the Environmental Protection Agency can set clean air standards. We can issue permits. We can even do enforcement and inspections and all that great stuff. But companies are saying, that's great. As long as we know you're not going to change the rules on us, that's fine. But how can we innovate to go beyond? And how can we innovate to find cheaper ways to meet those standards? So I don't think government is obsolete. I think it is the challenge of government to make sure that we are fully harnessing the trends around lower energy use, lower water use, more recycling, a circular economy, all those kind of buzzwords that really are happening. We have to make sure first we don't get in the way of that. I will say that the frustrations in Washington are real. I mean, you know that and I know that, but there is a need for us as a country to be able to make progress of that's beyond just, you know, moving things along a couple months at a time. And so I don't label the federal government or Congress in the same pot as I might a local government, where I think there are real innovations happening, or a state government, you're a governor, where there's still progress being made.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to that conversation about the role of government and the role of the private sector, but I do want to start because there's a bunch of smarty pants people out here, and they are all, I'm sure, eager to solve problems. So as EPA Administrator, Lisa, what do you see as the biggest opportunities for entrepreneurs and Silicon Valley to have impact on from your perspective?
So, you know, when the rest of us and the rest of the country think of Silicon Valley, we think about data and information. And I get asked a lot as head of the Environmental Protection Agency, what's the most powerful environmental law that we have? And I always answer the Community Right to Know Act. Because the Community Right to Know Act is quite simple. It's the idea that a community has a right to know how much pollution is going into the air in their neighborhood, how much is going in the air near the school, what's being discharged into the local creek, what's being discharged into the groundwater, how much waste is disposed of by ton at the landfill a couple of miles away. And from that simple right to know, which grew out of, you know, the terrible tragedy that was Bhopal, comes action, comes protections that communities demand for themselves. I think most of us outside of government have no idea of the treasure trove of information about pollution, about energy use, about trends, about pollution prevention, pesticide use, you name it, the data that resides with governments writ large, the federal government, local governments, county governments. And the challenge is to take the spirit of the Community Right to Know Act and make that information available in a way where communities can use it and act. And it's not just a national challenge. In some ways, that challenge might be most pertinent internationally, where some countries are dealing with very real consequences of pretty pervasive issues around pollution.
So you would say to them that one of the ways that entrepreneurs could help move things along is by developing technological solutions for monitoring pollution, so that you can fulfill the right to know act that allows people to know, right? Real-time monitoring, real-time flows of pollution, point of source, so that you can at least see where it's coming from, in addition to how much is out there?
I think that's right. I think that there are monitoring companies right now who have taken air monitoring from, when I started, air monitors looked like that podium, if not larger. And they were batch, not necessarily real time. And now there are monitors. I was in Oakland not long ago, and there were kids who were carrying what looked like backpacks back and forth to school every day, which were really real-time air monitors, so they could see what they were breathing in their breathing space, which is not the same as my breathing space or yours. So it's really, how do you use that data? How do you collect and collate all that information? How does that turn into action? And interestingly enough, just like everything else, there's more and more citizen source data. More and more people are able to monitor their own environment and want to know and be able to be part of a network that tells them what that means for their health. So I know what the air quality is in my neighborhood. What does that mean for me from a health perspective? What does that mean for my family? Is my home healthy and safe? Is the school healthy and safe? What are the biggest threats? So it's kind of taking all those inputs and being able to put it back out in a way that's very helpful.
Well, and I don't want to put Silicon Valley just in the technology-only box, but while we're on that subject, one of the biggest complaints from the business community is the regulatory regime and how unbelievably ossified it is and slow it is to move and how much time. Is there a technological fix that could be emanating from the technology community to streamline? How do we leverage technology to better serve people in a real quick way from a regulatory perspective?
It's a great question, and of course there are fixes. I mean, you have to, one of the fundamentals of sort of environmental protection has been that it is a government function. So you have to challenge yourself to say, what is really a government function about protecting public health and the environment, and what could be privatized, or what could be better done and safely done and fairly done and justly done by the private sector. And that's an issue that I actually think deserves a lot more thought than we can do right this second. But if you say, here is the model of environmental protection in almost every country right now. It is based on, sort of 1960s idea that you decide you want to build X, Y, or Z, or do X, Y, and Z, and that is going to have a cost in terms of some amount of pollution. You're going to have to emit something to the air or to the water. And we writ large, some government entity, some regulator says, here's how much you are permitted to pollute. You get a permit. In fact, it's called a permit. And then some government entity has some way of policing that. Are you in compliance with your permit? Turning that on its head would be to change that system. Mm-hmm. Is there another way to do that using technology where you wouldn't have to go through that process? And I don't think that we have explored that enough, but part of the reason is because government does have laws that are built around the old system.
Yeah, and of course they do, and a lot of times those laws were adopted at a time they made perfect sense, but the world has changed, and now they are stuck, you're stuck in an old system, an old paper system when where you put a stamp on a letter and it takes all these days, and so you've got notice requirements that don't make sense anymore, that kind of stuff.
EPA is all electronic now in terms of data. Congress actually
That's great.
Passed the rule last year for e-manifests for data movement, for hazardous waste movement. So the theory was if you're sophisticated enough to generate hazardous waste, you probably should be able to use a computer and manifest yourself electronically. So I think we're there, but it took a little while. So yes, you're absolutely right.
So when I say, the Silicon Valley area, of course, they've got a lot of folks who are also working on energy. And, I would say the world's biggest problem is the climate. If you moved into the private sector and you were looking forward into the biggest opportunities, where would you go? What area of energy or efficiency would be the biggest opportunity for growth, or the biggest problem that has a need for a solution?
I don't know that there are huge surprises there. I don't know your businesses as well as you do, and I'd be curious to know your thoughts on that too. But obviously, energy usage, so efficiency, whether that's, and Rob talked about some of the places he's been rewarded for some of the innovations around data use. I mean, what his whole system is trying to do is make people think before they procure about the long-term impacts from a carbon and energy usage perspective of the decisions that are being made. And so obviously any company has, it always amazes me that we need to incentivize any commercial enterprise to think about energy efficiency because the paybacks are often so quick. And I'm talking to some people here across this whole area who I think are developing the tools needed to be able to make those decisions awfully quickly. And so then it becomes a matter of evangelizing. And maybe, you know, if I had one wish, evangelizing loudly to elected officials who, the other reason so many Americans are concerned is that they're becoming concerned that the Congress doesn't really reflect in its deliberations what people really want. And I think that's, I'm trying to be nice.
That same poll that I referenced gave Congress a 9% approval rating today. And it wasn't just cockroaches they were compared to. It was sort of a fun poll by PPP. You can look it up online. They were asked, do you prefer Congress or cockroaches, Congress or head lice, Congress or Brussels sprouts, Congress or Lindsay Lohan? Lindsay Lohan was the only one who rated lower than Congress, for what it's worth. Anyway, but there's opportunity. I don't mean to be so down on government. I'm just down on the House, I'll just say that, in Congress. So I am curious, you are leaving, and every time you're leaving a big job, you get a chance to look back and reflect at your most proud moments or the best things that you want to have been remembered for. What would you say are your legacy, what are you cavelling at? What are you happy about?
So I guess three things. The first, most of you might not know, I started at EPA in 1987 as a staff-level engineer. I was going to go for 3 years, young people, to just punch my ticket in and go make a lot of money. And then 25 years later, who knows? So it's all, don't plan too much because you never know. 4 years ago when we came in, we were talking about an agency that had been pretty battered and bruised, that had suffered from the belief that it couldn't put forward good science, that had been either suppressed or tampered with, and that it was becoming unable to do its job. I mean, EPA has a really fundamental job, which is to protect the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, to ensure that those are not afterthoughts on the path to our economic success, that they're part of the equation of prosperity. So I think very important was the opportunity, as an honor, to go back to a place you worked and started, that launched your career and helped right the ship. And I feel like we've done that. And I think the embodiment of that early on was our finding that greenhouse gases endanger public health and welfare, which we did. It's called the endangerment finding for policy wonks. I see we have some here, some policy students of policy. And from that, it's a formal finding that is required under our Federal Clean Air Act. If you don't make that finding, then you don't have pollution that's actionable, essentially. And that finding, the science to support said finding, was actually done before President Obama was elected, but had been suppressed. In fact, the finding had been written and was sent over to the White House, and they wouldn't open the email. That's a true story. And so, we were able to say on behalf of the people of this country that, yes, greenhouse gases, this is a scientific finding. It's not a political science finding. Endanger our welfare, endanger our health. And from that comes other wonky things like the new auto efficiency standards. We finally have a national standard for automobiles, which is when I got to know Jennifer, her advocacy, the importance to that automobile sector of having a set of standards that would allow innovation, but also just basic design and development. And things like our proposed standards for power plants, for greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. So I'm really proud of that. I feel like it's a little bit like nicotine in cigarettes. Once you make the finding that nicotine is an addictive drug, you can't look at it again the same way. And once this country says that greenhouse gases endanger our welfare and the welfare of future generations, we shouldn't and can't look at it the same way. And so we're really proud of that. And then second is I'm the first African American to run the Environmental Protection Agency, and one of the things, diversity, yeah. It is a myth that people of all diverse backgrounds, that African Americans or people of color have other things to worry about and are not environmentalists. I'm living proof that certainly we are. And so we made a point of what we called expanding the conversation on environmentalism, which is a real mouthful. I hated it when we came up with the term, but now I love it, because the idea was you don't just have to be a conservationist or a person who loves the great outdoors to be an environmentalist. You could very well be a 50-year-old mom of 2 children with asthma who grew up in Cancer Alley in the 9th Ward of New Orleans, who knows firsthand what kind of devastation that can mean for a family and how unjust it is to have to deal with pollution that you have no hand in addressing. So we've done a lot of that, and I think it's really important as our country is becoming more diverse that all voices have a seat at the table, even those who might step forward and say, I don't agree with traditional environmental issues. We've had those discussions.
Before you get to your third point on that issue, have obviously you embody, you are a role model as well for women and children of color to take on STEM kinds of studies. I mean, you were somebody, she went to Tulane, she graduated summa cum laude, she's totally a whiz, but you were tapped by people who mentored you and encouraged you to go into the sciences, which may not have been, I don't know if that was something you were just great at math and they said, let's make sure she goes and takes on some STEM stuff. But is this something that that you personally have been championing for young people to look at the STEM degrees?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, it's an interesting connection for many young children. Their first real science is with the environment, is with the natural environment. They're outside, they're into bugs, or they're into air, or they're into water. Their first scientific experiment might be some water monitoring down at the local stream, or it might be something very simple. And young children invariably are drawn to that connection to nature, their role in sort of the larger web. And they're, of course, endlessly optimistic and fun. So we start there. We actually have an eSTEM program we've started to work on. We haven't had tons of funding, but the idea just to work with some companies, Microsoft is one of them, to try to make sure that we use the environment and that interest in the environment to ensure that we're pushing science and technology and math. I think that clearly the president said we need a million more engineers, and we absolutely do. But we have to make sure that we also model for women and young girls scientists who don't necessarily fall into that stereotype that might draw them away.
So you said you had 3 things that you were proud of.
Well, I don't know if it's a third. I would say the other place where there's real opportunity and where I think the next administrator is going to have tons of fun. When we came in, we also had this huge backlog of court cases and decisions and rules that have been sent back to EPA as being illegal. We've done quite a bit of that work. We still have some to do, but I'm really intrigued with the sustainability piece of it. Sustainability is not new, but studies and folks are now documenting that most large companies have some kind of sustainability effort. It might not be as advanced as Microsoft or some of the efforts we see around Silicon Valley, but why aren't we able to take that and say, what's the role of an environmental protection agency in not regulating sustainability? We don't want to do that, but encouraging it, putting forward the the clear energy savings and water savings and toxic savings and pollution prevention that comes out of that. And so
So the department is going to be proactive in working with private sector entities to help guide people in the best practices
I think that's right.
for sustainability, which is something that you've set in motion.
Yeah, absolutely. We did a National Academy of Sciences study 2 years ago and asked them, tell us what we can do as regulators to deal with sustainability. Everything we do at EPA right now is based on risk. It's to prevent something bad from happening to you. What if we flipped that paradigm and said, how about everything we do being to look at sustainability principles and ensuring that we're living up to those, at least the principles around not depleting natural resources at the expense of growth today. And so we're having
It's interesting because the idea of what the EPA does in terms of protecting something bad from happening to you is a sort of defense mode, and the department itself has been in defense mode with with Congress. I'm curious because you lead such a large organization, and running a large organization that is under attack, and it's safe to say that the EPA has been under sustained attack by Congress. In fact, I think the chair of the House Energy Committee, who happens to be somebody from Michigan, Fred Upton, said that he's going to have you come to Congress to testify so often they're just going to get her a parking spot or something like that over there. How do you lead an organization? Describe what that's like, leading an organization that is under sustained attack and keeping morale up.
It's not the first time EPA's been under attack. In fact, maybe the hardest part of leading that organization is that it tends to have peaks and valleys that are driven, at least in part, politically. And so how do you keep 17,000 people, and by the way, the largest percentage of scientists and engineers of any agency except for NASA actually in government. Most people don't realize how many scientists are at the EPA. How do you keep people motivated? And we have one huge advantage, which is people come to Environmental Protection Agency because they believe in the mission. I don't like to compare myself to any of my other fellow cabinet members, but people are drawn to what we do. So that mission orientation is a huge motivator. The fact that I was from the agency, I think, was a huge advantage, and we've lifted up people who've been at the agency for a long time and put them into positions of leadership. We've challenged people to think differently about their job. But probably the most important is we've said the three things we care most about are science. We want the best science that we can muster on behalf of the American people. That's what the American people deserve. We should be their consultants on issues of public health and the environment and the law. The laws in our country are very strong. They haven't been updated in a long time. Part of that is that they've been under attack for a long time, and so you have to think about the trade-off of updating versus losing ground on them, but making sure that you don't go outside that authority is important as well.
So talk about the relationship then with the private sector, because this private sector, the role of government and the role of the private sector, I think, is a really important forward-looking opportunity. And if the private sector, especially like Microsoft in a global economy, they've got to operate in all of these countries who may have different rules and more advanced rules than the United States. How does the private sector, how can government intersect with the private sector in such a way as to incentivize private sector collaboration that actually drags policy along, if you will, rather than expecting that government is going to be the lead operator on policy?
I'm not sure that we can, what we can do is level the playing field. We can't pick winners and losers very often. That's not necessarily something that we try to aspire to at EPA. But I say all the time that if we set the floor, people can go beyond for various reasons, but we're not going to be able to set the ceiling. We're not going to be able to determine where things stop. Let me unpack that a little bit. We have probably twice as many cars on the road owned by Americans today as when EPA came to be. EPA came to be in 1970 by Richard Nixon. Just a little trivia point for those of you who don't remember it.
Important.
That well-known communist, socialist, but which we are sometimes equated with, but. So, I mean, I think, so we have twice as many cars on the road as 1970, but we have no more pollution, in fact, much less pollution, right? Why? Because every time EPA has set a standard for pollution, not just tailpipe emissions for greenhouse gas, but tailpipe emissions for smog, tailpipe emissions for lead, tailpipe emissions for volatile organics. Every time we do that, American engineers and know-how respond with, oh, this is the standard, I can do better than that, and I can get there cheaper than my competitor, who's also trying to build the widget to do exactly the same thing. So all we do is set the goal, and then we get out of the way. And time again, that goal is exceeded. It's much, much cheaper. We have a long history of greatly overestimating the cost of our rules in terms of compliance for the exact same reason. Once the rule is set in stone, engineers and innovators find a cheaper way to get there. So we usually overestimate costs, not underestimate costs. I say all that to say I think as a regulator, it is in our place in free enterprise to try to constrain the system from innovating, but rather to set a floor so that there's a level playing field. The biggest complaint I'll get from someone is, I'm doing all the things you asked me to do, and I'm doing it exactly like you want, but my competitor over here is cutting corners or not doing it, and they're not suffering economically enough to make it worth their while to comply. So we work really hard at that leveling of the playing field. And again, that's an opportunity from an innovation perspective, because you cannot have 300 million inspectors out there checking every single emission point, except you can if every single citizen has the way to check every single emission point. And so I say to my staff all the time, more and more, there are 300 million inspectors in the United States of America if they had the tools to know how to check to ensure that people are in compliance.
I think one of the you list as one of the examples that you're most proud of is the CAFE standards, the corporate average fuel economy standards. You know, from my perspective as the former governor of Michigan, when that was adopted, California, of course, was trying to sort of push the envelope and got the rest of the country to sort of come on board. And it was Michigan that was seen, the big three that were seen initially as dragging their feet. But it ended up, because of circumstances and the auto meltdown, that it was a right moment to take advantage of the crisis and call for something greater. So Lisa's shop, in partnership with others in the president's office, really pushed this rate in the fuel economy increases. What was interesting is that the policy was done in tandem with DOE investments in making sure the technology could meet that new standard. And so DOE has a bit of money, or at least had a bit of money, that was able to, incentivize the research and the commercialization of that technology. Does EPA do any of that side of things? Do you have inside of EPA, or is there an opportunity inside of EPA to incentivize the private sector to take those advances on, or is that something that is left more to the partner agency of DOE?
We do have a big research and development arm. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year on grants in our to academic institutions. Many of you, some of you may be working under EPA grants, and also to they're not private to the private sector, but they're to citizen scientists of all types, environmental groups, NGOs, folks who are good, accomplished scientists in their own right. But we don't have a lot of money to say, we'd like you to meet this standard, here's some money to help you get there. I wish we did, because the conversation would be entirely different. At times I tease my fellow cabinet members, oh yeah, it's easy for you to say because you can give them a grant, but we don't really have that. What we do is try to set a common sense floor, and then let the free enterprise system realize that that's just a rule of the road, to continue.
Well, it's interesting because in the auto case, the Department of Energy put out grants, especially for energy storage, the batteries that would power, of course, the next electric vehicles, and that ended up being just a massive opportunity, not just for the auto industry, but for the industrial Midwest, for states like Michigan, because the battery itself and the supply chain to the battery, the anode, the cathode, the separator material, the electrolyte, all of those are different companies. And so we wanted to create an economic cluster around this solution that started with the raising of those standards. So, and the auto industry, when the standards were raised, it's the same argument that I think the private sector can continue to pressure the government on, which is we don't want to have a patchwork set of standards from different states. We can't build 50 different cars. We want one standard. And if you can help us get there so that we're not going bankrupt, that would be, that's the best of all possible solutions. So the question that I have is, given the desire from the private sector not to engage in sort of this patchwork compliance system, the patchwork global compliance system, doesn't it make sense for these multinational companies? I just can't help but say that they are in the best opportunity. They have the best opportunity to help pressure government for a standard that the United States that is not lower than other places that they're doing business in.
Absolutely. I don't know that that's. Let me make sure I understand the question.
Just expand the field globally, not just in the U.S.
So,
right?
So oftentimes, it's not that we're being asked to change other people's standards, but traditionally the United States has, with some countries in Western Europe, say, set the standards that the world operates under. And that's still largely true. If you want to know how the world looks at a particular pesticide, oftentimes look at how the United States looks at it, although there are some notable examples where we differ from some other countries. So I think one of the questions is, undoubtedly, if you're working in a multinational corporation, you are seeing a patchwork of standards depending on where you are working, and they could be vastly different. And one of the big things I keep saying is no one in this country I've ever met thinks we should be racing to the bottom to meet the lowest, because that's not going to be, that's moving backwards and rolling back a standard of protection we've come to be used to. The question, I think, going forward for many other nations is the United States going to continue to be that leader, to be someone we're trying to catch up to, and coming up with the technologies that help us get there in a way that doesn't sacrifice quality of life or development potential, because that's a big issue as well.
So if you are advising, say you're advising a young business class or a class full of entrepreneurs about trends in the next 10 years, what areas should they be looking at to solve problems? You had mentioned monitoring, but beyond monitoring, technology, et cetera, because we're in Silicon Valley. Beyond that, what are the things that you think young, up-and-coming problem solvers should have an eye on?
The majority of the world's citizens live in urban areas now. And that's true in our country, but it's true in the world, and every trend says that that's going to just continue to be the case. As developing countries continue to develop, what happens, the trend is that people move into more urban environments, and those people are going to need water, they're going to need something to do with sewage, with wastewater, they're going to need food, they're going to need energy, they're going to need access to energy. And so any of the issues that help make urban areas more efficient and more just in terms of delivering those basic things to people are going to be incredibly important, and stabilizing to developing countries. Because if all those people show up in an urban area and can't get those basics, then you're going to have a very unstable environment with lots and lots of people. So I think the number one trend is urbanization, and the fact that some people might say population as well, which is part of it, but the fact that so many people are now living in urban environments. I would say, just in my wonky world, I don't know that this is number one trend for business students, but when you think about the next patchwork, in many areas it's around toxic chemicals, and there is beginning to be sort of I don't know if you see this yet, Rob, but sort of different ways that different localities, different states, California is a great example, different countries, look at manufacturing and the raw materials and the products of manufacturing and the way different consumers feel about what's in the products, whether it's their food, whether it's their clothing, whether it's in, this cup. And I think that many companies who are petrochemical oriented and chemical companies are looking at that as one of the major trends, some certainty around one set of standards around toxic chemicals. And I've been pretty vocal, and the president has been wonderful about his administration supporting the need for a real revamp of our toxic chemical laws in this country that doesn't get in the way of innovation, but also doesn't put the assessment of risk after the commercialization of the product. There's a lot of that's gone on.
One of the biggest, speaking of toxic chemicals and chemistry, one of the biggest challenges I think that's out there in light of the advances in natural gas and natural gas exploration and the shale gas is the opportunity to find solutions to fracking and the chemicals that are put into the water. And I'm wondering if, is that under EPA's purview, the fracking rules?
They could be. EPA is in the middle of a long study which would inform the need for additional national rulemaking. EPA is precluded from a lot of regulation of fracking right now by laws passed in the last, 5 or 10 years.
So they're not allowing you to do.
Yeah, the laws right now give exemptions for the injection of fracking chemicals. EPA doesn't regulate them on a national level. The industry has stepped forward with some voluntary disclosure. Some states are doing a bit around that as well. But one of the big policy debates is whether you need national standards, so once again, there's a level playing field, or whether this patchwork of state standards is
So as a chemical engineer, do you think that there is a technological or chemistry solution that would allow the U.S. to unlock a lot of this without harming the water and be able to export natural gas in addition to using it ourselves?
I won't go so far as to whether we should import or export. I know that's a big policy issue in Washington, one I don't really have the ability to speak on. I will say hydraulic fracking, in my mind, could be done safely. But the way to do it safely is not to walk away and say, please don't hassle us because we need to get this done. Which I think in the beginning, some companies were there. They were just sort of like, giving us the hand and giving governments the hand. And now I think they're starting to realize that the American people have a long history with drilling and production activities, and they're smart enough to be able to realize how intrusive they are, and that they're not going to get the social license they need to operate by keeping regulation and governments at bay. So now the big debate has been, should that be a federal level regulation or a state level regulation? And I'm enough of a scientist and engineer to say, I think we don't have the data yet to show.
If water, does water know geopolitical boundaries?
No, water doesn't, but I actually happen to believe that some of the issues around fracking aren't what's injected into the water, but what happens to all that water when you pull it back out of the hole. And then how do you dispose of that? Or the leaking of natural gas that happens. Natural gas is a fairly potent greenhouse gas all by itself. So here we are taking some important steps to cut down on greenhouse gas emissions from cars and power plants, but now we're going to start leaking methane. That's not a good thing.
Although I did read an article today on this that's saying that there's some new advances in tracers and monitoring, back to your monitoring point, that would at least highlight where the problem is so that it could be fixed. But it's just not deployed. It's just not deployed yet.
Can it be done safely? Probably.
Needs work.
But and should it and must it be done safely? Absolutely.
Yes. Right.
Absolutely.
Right. So you said that you were prohibited from acting in that area, and I know that there's been efforts to prohibit you from acting in a lot of areas. Would you say that, I don't want to lead you on that, but what's been your biggest frustration with D.C.?
It's so lovely there. It has become incredibly partisan and polarized. And the environment and environmental protection was traditionally in our country not something that one party believed in and the other party didn't, or one party favored and the other party didn't. I was, making a bad joke that EPA was started by a Republican president, Richard Nixon. Almost all of our major environmental laws, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, were passed with overwhelming, if not unanimous, votes in, bipartisan Congress, and then lots of them signed by Republican presidents. Cap and trade, which has gotten such horrible billing, was actually a Republican idea of a way to deal with air pollution that was more market-based instead of command and control regulation. And all that has now become fodder for a machine that has become very good in Washington at killing every idea and sometimes smearing people's characters along with that, but not coming up with any positive solutions to any of those problems. If you don't think we should be doing cap and trade to put a price on carbon, what is our way of dealing with this really important threat? Or
denying that that climate change happens,
Yeah,
that's the answer.
Yeah, but I don't think that's where the American people are. I mean,
well, that's why Congress's approval rating is at 8%.
Are you there? Yes. Okay, thank you.
Pardon me?
It's a myth, global warming. Okay, well, I disagree, but thank you for your opinion.
Well, 99%
I
of scientists
didn't say all
disagree
Americans,
with you,
but
but
I
anyway.
don't think that the amount of Americans in the country, I don't think the majority of Americans agree with you.
I know they don't. So I know we're going to take some questions, and which is great. And what we'd love for you to do is in the question taking, we want you to put your name and your affiliation on there so I can acknowledge you as the questions are coming. Holy moly! And I sure hope you guys have good handwriting, because
somebody wrote really small on that.
Oh my gosh! All right, I'm going to read it because I haven't had a chance. And while she's answering, I'll go to the next one. But I hope this is a good question, because. But where's the name on it? You all didn't do your instruction. Oh wait, I'm not going to read that one yet because it doesn't have a name. All right, Joanna Nowak. Where are you, Joanna? All right, Joanna, back there. All right, President Obama promised to make a final decision, Ray. I was going to ask this too. I knew one of y'all would ask. The Keystone Pipeline after elections, do you believe this administration is ready to make that decision? If so, what do you think that decision is going to be? And I would just add, I read an article that you might be leaving before that decision is made, and I was wondering if that was any indication of where the decision was going.
Oh, you added that last
No,
part.
no, she wrote
This
that.
is what you need girlfriends for, right? To act. Thank you, Joanna. You meant
I
just
added
number one.
like that.
Listen, I think that the president, I will almost certainly be gone before that decision is made. And I don't know where that decision's going to come down. The next step in the process is an environmental impact statement, a revised environmental impact statement that the Department of State is in charge of doing because of the arcaneness of the National Environmental Policy Act, because it crosses national borders. The Department of State is doing this environmental impact statement. Then will come a process of public comment when that environmental impact statement comes out, and then will come other agencies weighing in, and then finally, if it gets to that point, the president may be called upon to make a determination as to whether or not this pipeline is in our country's national interest because it crosses an international border. And I think through all of that process will come really important information about what the impacts of this are on groundwater quality, on potential pollution pathways, on real life estimates of what it means from an economic perspective for our country, because proponents of the pipeline want to talk a lot about jobs, and there's been a lot of, I think, inflation in terms of job estimates around this pipeline and what it means. So I think it is too soon in the process. I mean, people don't like process around government, but on cases like this, I think a public process is absolutely vital and is really the only way to allow the public to believe that its government is acting in its interests, not any special interest.
Just as a follow-up to that, which was the first card that was on the list, a study published this week in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found significant increases in carcinogens associated with the Alberta tar sands, illustrating what they're saying is the failure of the industry self-regulation and the effects of U.S. consumption on international pollution. And they're asking what's CEP's role in both developing effective regulatory frameworks and monitoring our impact on the environment outside of our borders.
Interesting. So EPA doesn't. I'm happy to report that the one thing we don't do, I'm looking at Joanna again, but I assume that's not your question, but EPA doesn't regulate pollution outside of the United States. My job would be much harder than I imagine. But we do, and again, have a history of trying to add to the scientific knowledge and the base of information that allows us all to make smart and wise and intelligent decisions about controlling pollution. I just read about that study today in popular media, so I'm not going to comment on the specifics of the study except to say what it's measuring is polyaromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, the heavies that go along with most hydrocarbons. You're going to find them in tar sands. You're going to find them in tar. You're going to find them in the ash in your backyard barbecue pit, for that matter, as well. So whenever you find pollution, the most important issue is there a pathway to receptors, human receptors or ecological receptors, that make that an unacceptable pathway for pollution. I was about to say risk, but threat to public health or to the environment. And I don't think it's surprising, given that most of that tar sand waste is strip mined, that you're going to see some migration of those tars throughout the area.
So I have a whole bunch of questions that are sort of in the same vein, and one of them is just sort of a question that begs, can we please have a price on carbon right away?
Are you asking me or Congress?
That was the question, and a series of them that are very similar. That really the question is there any hope for national cap and trade? Is there any hope for some sort of national price on carbon, although you can't say a carbon tax or you'd get shot right out of the chair, I'm sure, but you know what I'm saying. Is there any chance for a national policy?
Well, let's be really clear. Regulation does, in fact, put an imperfect sort of a cost to pollution. I mean, one of the first things that any kind of regulation does is say, this external thing you're doing, which is emitting pollution, is a cost that you now have to internalize by controlling it. You're not going to get rid of it entirely, but it's going to cost you more to operate, potentially, until we figure out how to do it cheaply. That's how we come up with our cost estimates. We do a cost-benefit analysis. How much more is it going to cost you to control, and what's the benefit on the public health side? And our regulations have enormous benefits in terms of the costs. I think it's time for us to be pretty real. The current the current milieu around climate doesn't lead me to believe that we're going to see a new national law anytime soon. But, and there's a huge but, the federal game should not be the only game in town. Local actions, state actions, and the private sector are extremely important. And so I am an optimist by nature most of the time. And don't think that we should assume that because we don't have a national law that deals with carbon pollution, that means we can't make progress, because we must make progress.
I just want to say on that, too. First of all, the young people out here, I can see a lot of students who wrote cards expressing the same sort of frustration that there's no national effort on climate. And I would say that I do think that there is an opportunity, and I was describing this to Lisa earlier, from the bottom up, which is if you think about one of the most effective pieces of public policy that the president has adopted since he has come into office, it was in getting states to act on raising education standards in the race to the top. And why did states act? They acted because the federal government put out a pot of money, it was $4.5 billion, and said, if you want to compete for this, states, you states who are cash hungry, then you have, the price of entry is that you have to raise your standards. I think the federal government can do the same thing on clean energy. I think the federal government can put out a pot of money and say to the states, you can choose to enter or not, and respect the state's independence. But if you choose to enter, the price of entry is you have to have a renewable energy standard of such an amount or whatever, but you also have to respect the geographic resources of each of the states and the regions, but come up with a plan that creates jobs and that reduces your carbon footprint and that contributes to having a national energy policy. So I think it can be done, but it can't be done from Congress top down. I think it's got to be done respecting the states. And California is a great example of a state that has taken this on its own. But what good is it for California to do alone if there's no other partners around? And if this country doesn't lead the discussion on global climate change, it's just not going anywhere. That's my editorial opinion. I'm the moderator. Sorry about that. Okay. The question is, what's the short and long-term future of coal-fired power in the United States? This is from Clint Wilder from Clean Edge. Clint, thank you.
Well, I think that coal-fired power plants, they're in two varieties, right? The ones yet to be built and the ones that are already out there. And for the longest, there was sort of these vintage 40, 50, 60, 70-year-old plants. There really was one, I think, that was pushing 70-year-old coal-fired power plants that had not been significantly invested in much since they were built. There weren't a lot of pollution controls on them. And for those plants, they've sort of been waiting around for that time when the cost of doing business, meaning the need to invest in them, outweighed the money that they could potentially make. And that moment is here. Mostly, not mostly, partially because of our mercury rules. EPA has rules for mercury. They were called for in the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act. We got them done last year, finally, in response to court orders to do them, by the way. So it's not a schedule to be proud of in any way, although we're proud we finally got them done, and they're here to stay. But those plants are in one category, and what we see are those plants making the business decision that anyone would make. Am I going to invest in the amount of money it takes to clean up those plants from the standpoint of mercury and arsenic and nickel and the fine particulates upon which they travel? And that's a fairly easy answer. And it's made easier by the fact that natural gas is extraordinarily inexpensive right now. And that... there was an announcement just yesterday from another major power supplier, and they cited the need to comply with EPA regulations, but they also cited quite clearly the market forces that are drawing them away from investing in new coal, certainly, in some of their existing fleet, and moving them towards combined cycle natural gas generation. So that's happening as well. It would be wrong, by the way, not to acknowledge that this country has done quite a bit in the last 4 years through the Department of Energy on renewables, on solar, on wind, on advanced batteries, on storage, on research and development, and in some cases deployment of technology, and looking smartly at transmission questions, which remain very much in our grid. And so all that has happened along with the use of the Clean Air Act based on the endangerment findings. So the new rules that we have out in a proposed form, we got 3 million comments on these rules that say if you're going to build a new coal-fired power plant, you have to control the greenhouse gas pollution, the carbon dioxide emissions. Those need to be finalized. They are not in final form. And so that's probably the next step along this path from the standpoint of regulation.
Okay, so this question sort of flows from that, in that you said it would be remiss not to acknowledge. This is from Victoria, and I'm sorry, Victoria, I can't, is it Aratui from Santa Clara University? Where are you, Victoria? Okay, great. Victoria says, how do you react to statements such as President Obama promised to slow the rise of the oceans and heal the planet? My promise is to help you and your family. That was from, of course, Mitt Romney in his convention speech. React.
Where's Victoria? I don't think my reaction is nearly as important as the electorate's. Do you?
Ching!
You know, I think I was personally aghast that somebody would make a joke about climate change and rising sea level. And for somebody who grew up in New Orleans, my mom lost her home to Hurricane Katrina. It wasn't caused by climate change, but to see, I mean, what I tell people is, you know, stop wasting the emotional energy of trying to decide if any one storm is caused by any 1 ton of CO2, and realize that what it's about is trends of having to deal with that, whether it's in, you know, the East Coast, northeast coast of the United States, the South, the arid, the droughts in the West, having to deal with those kind of conditions over and over again.
Wasn't there a NOAA study? Did anybody read that out today?
Yeah, last year was the warmest year.
The warmest year on record. And I'm looking at you. All right, so oh, honey. Okay, this is a question. Who would you want to see as your successor, or what sector do you think they should come from, government, private, or academia?
Wow, who asked that question?
And there's no name on it.
Oh, do you want the job?
I bet you there are a lot of people here who would love the job.
I have been.
You would probably.
You listen. This is the president's prerogative, and so one of the things that I think is really important if you're going to run any organization is succession planning. And I have the president has an amazing team at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. 2 of them are here today. The deputy at the Environmental Protection Agency, Bob Perciasepi, is a veteran of EPA. He ran the air program under Clinton. He ran the water program under Clinton. He's now deputy at the agency. We have immense talent. So I leave not at all. I mean, although it will be very hard. I will have been at EPA on and off for 25 years to walk out of the door. Part of the reason is because I feel so strongly that the agency is pointed in the right direction and has immense talent. I don't think it matters what sector you come from. But I do think it requires an ability to recognize that the agency works for the American people, not for any special interest group. That the work of the agency is such that, sadly, and I don't think this should continue to be the case. We were talking about this earlier. There should absolutely not be this belief that in order for EPA to make progress, somebody has to lose. This is not a zero-sum game by a long shot, but that you have to believe that and enforce it internally and externally constant, that there are win-win strategies and win-win situations, and we're looking for those, but not at the expense of allowing folks to continue in the year 2012 to emit unlimited amounts of mercury into the air. It's both. You are a regulator. You set standards. They need to be enforced and they need to be fair, but there is tremendous potential to make progress at the same time. All the rest of it, the amazing staff there can help the next administrator do. But that belief that the work is vital, almost sacred, is really, really important.
I love that.
Yeah,
I mean, I love that, calling it sacred. It's really, really important.
It is important.
Really important to honor the people who are doing that work. And there's a lot of questions in here about what advice would you have to young people who want to address these big problems and serve in government? What would be the best path for them to go?
I think public service is incredibly important. I mean, I'm the daughter of a mailman, so I always say I'm pretty sure I got some of my belief that of public service and seeing that what a part of his community he was. I really dislike seeing this villainization of public servants as somehow not being really important in parts of our community. I don't think that's going to serve our country well, and I certainly get really worried about the kind of talent I see potentially being turned off by, we were talking about that earlier. This is a waste of time, and so we're not going to do it at all. I would say try it. Do the Lisa Jackson method and try it for 3 years and figure you're just going to go in and see it for yourself. That's an option. I would say that the federal government is not the only game in town, that local governments are doing amazing things and innovative things and are much more nimble. It is absolutely true. I worked at the state of New Jersey for several years. Local and state governments are much more nimble than the federal government. And so if, everything you hear about bureaucracy is not turning you on, then think about getting involved at the local level. And if you don't want to do government, there's public service that's very much grows out of academia and the private sector. I would argue that you can be in the private sector and still have a call towards looking at issues larger than just what's directly in front of you.
And NGOs too. I mean, non-governmental organizations really. And in that vein, would you, the NGOs often can push harder because they want to see the change happen, change from without and change from within. Which one do you think has the greatest impact?
You mean the pushing from?
Right. I mean, the outside organizations pushing on government or working inside the system to make changes from within. Which one has the greatest opportunity to make change?
In our democracy, I think the will of the people is the most important issue, and giving the people a way to be heard, and in any democracy. And so I remain a firm believer that the first and most important call to public service is being a good citizen, an active, committed, engaged citizen. And I think that that's really important. And that's another thing Silicon Valley does really well, which is allow people to become much more active and engaged in issues they care about without necessarily having to spend a dime. Or, well, you have to spend a few dimes to buy a Microsoft product, but to spend too many dimes to be able to do that.
Meaning using technology to democratize, to enhance democracy through what, like crowdsourcing and all of fund sourcing too, actually, for if you want to donate to political candidates in some way, shape, or form.
Crowdsourcing innovations, crowdfunding, the citizen science, crowdsourcing information, making it so that if the motto is that I'm going to go do my business over here and you're not going to be able to catch me, that should be a model that we can fix fairly easily.
So if you're not, if you're, and this is another question, this is from Allison Van Diggelen. Allison, where are you? We talked earlier. Did I pronounce it right? Okay. One of Allison's questions was really the best way for citizens to have an impact on the environment.
You have to get involved on the issues you care about, and usually that's in your local community. A lot of people don't care a whit about the environment until they start to think about starting a family. So I can't tell you how many young women I meet who say, I'm thinking about starting my family. What shouldn't I eat? Oh, my God, I'm really worried. Should I have a test in my hair? Do I need to worry about what the levels of lead or mercury are in my blood? And out of that activism, and we've seen the power of women, out of that activism comes a very different approach to looking at your local community. I worry a bit. I mean, if Bill Ruckelshaus, who was the very first administrator of the EPA, again appointed by a Republican, and he came back to the agency in one of its points where it had been rocked by some scandal to sort of right the ship again. So you can see why he's sort of one of my heroes. But, he says that one of the things we have to be careful about is not assuming that because we don't see the kind of pollution we used to see at noon in some of our urban areas, or we don't see stuff spewing out of pipes, that classic, gook coming out of a pipe, that we're done. Number one source of water pollution in our country, and it's very real, one source of impairment is sheet runoff. It rains and it picks up the pesticides and the fertilizers and the oil off of our urban streets and our rural landscapes and dumps it all into our waterways. So we still have work to do. We have to do it in a common sense way. We have to try to do it in ways that minimize regulations that can be onerous, and that might not be the most efficient way to always do it. But I worry that young people look around and go, looks pretty good to me, and don't realize that we face very real rollbacks. We spent the last 2 years with the president's support not having significant rollbacks in the Clean Air Act, but we faced vote after vote of folks who wanted, for the first time in my lifetime, which is longer than many of you, maybe not all, hopefully, but my lifetime, where we would see a huge rollback in environmental protection in this country, which is still awful well off. So it's, you know, it's becoming educated on the issues and not necessarily always agreeing, but being willing to also, this is really important as a scientist. You're not going to get unanimity amongst people, but you are going to get consensus. And when you're dealing with something like mercury, or you're dealing with soot, or you're dealing with climate change, I would argue that consensus is enough. If we wait for unanimity, we're still waiting for everybody to agree that, you know, cigarette smoking causes cancer. If you wait, you will have lost the window to act and avoid and prevent and mitigate and minimize.
Can I just also add on that I cannot say enough how critically important it is for everyday citizens to obviously vote, but communicate with your elected officials. One letter, we used to say in the governor's office, we get one letter that represents 25 citizens who didn't take the time to write. Those letters are read. A volume of communication that's not your, you know, rubber stamp communication, not the same cards everybody gives out, it's the same text on it. That's not what I'm talking about. Individual communication from citizens moves the needle. It really does. But the most thing that moves the needle is putting people in place, in office, that agree with you and recognize, having them realize that you hired them and you can fire them, and that as their employer, you have the right to give them an instruction on how you want them to do their job. And you should not be quiet about it. Really, they will listen if you're noisy, especially if you go to office hours. Okay. What role does, this is from Yanni from Microsoft. What role does mitigation have to address climate change, like seawalls, federal zoning, and floodplains, and all of that? I suppose you mean as opposed to adaptation.
Well, I mean adaptation as opposed to you know, all the numbers say the temperature's going up, right? So things like Hurricane Sandy. I mean, does the federal government have a role in, say, preventing building in floodplains and?
Yeah, so essentially the question was what role of adaptation, which is adapting our lifestyles and our norms to a new climate reality, to sea level rise, to changing climate, to changing temperatures, versus what traditionally people talk about when they talk about climate change, which is minimizing the emission of CO2 and other climate changing gases. So I think I agree. We're at the point now where we can no longer just assume that we can avoid a future of sea level rise and more dramatic temperature changes and more frequent storms and all the things that scientists tell us are possible as the climate changes. And we need to design with the future in mind to, at first, think about resiliency. But resiliency doesn't get you all the way there unless you also factor in a different set of assumptions about what the 100-year floodplain will be and how big that 500-year storm might be or how long the drought might last. And I do think that it is vitally important, but not happening in a uniform way, that people think about everything from building codes to energy use to water security to energy security with a climate changed future in mind. And that's probably going to borrow Jennifer's thinking, going to happen at the local level and then eventually move up to the federal level, because those are generally decisions, whether it's zoning or other issues that happen at the local level. The one big exception is federal floodplain delineations, which FEMA is changing. I just happen to know that they just changed them, for example, for New Jersey, where I used to work, and they were planning to change them all along. It happens that they changed them in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. And what that does is it does have a market impact because it makes it more expensive to buy insurance, and therefore it makes it a different decision in terms of whether or not to put huge amounts of property in what is now harm's way. So absolutely that needs to happen. As an engineer, I've argued for a long time to some of our nation's engineers that it's a dereliction not to be forcing that conversation, because we're just throwing bad money potentially after bad. And it's like an insurance policy. At worst, you don't want to go overboard, but we certainly could be doing more to be resilient. It's no different than building in an earthquake zone, which I imagine everybody here is really familiar with. You want to engineer with that potential, which is very real, in mind.
But on the other side, you don't want to continue to exacerbate the problems. And if you look at the climate maps in terms of the ocean footprint and the rising plains, they just approved a 50 or at least $7 billion of a $50 billion ask for Hurricane Sandy. That would be mitigation, or at least addressing the Hurricane Sandy issue. Insurance companies now are setting the price for climate by saying that we're not going to insure because it's becoming too expensive. Will the dollars and cents of climate change, do you think, perhaps, could it impact Congress to move, since they're only having to pay for it after the fact in the cleanups, which is probably more expensive to begin with?
Yeah, I mean, to move from very short-term thinking to long-term thinking is the key there, and we haven't seen a lot of that. It would be good to see. I would say that I do think that I used to give one speech that started with a quote that sounded like something the EPA administrator would say, and it was from an insurance executive at one of their national meetings about the need to really get in front of what was this overwhelming threat. And she or he, I'm not sure whether it was a man or a woman, they weren't talking about the environmental threat. They were talking about the looming economic threat to their business as they looked at losses they could not insure, and a business that just wasn't viable with some of the models that they were seeing.
We only have 7 more minutes, and so I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll wrap up with a final. But this one is, how can we make cities more fair environmentally? I know it's an issue near and dear to your heart.
Whose question is that? When you
That's
say
from,
fair,
Shauna.
Shauna, what do you mean?
I know that we organize where we live mostly based on how much money we have, so it means that people's situations are very, very different in terms of what people are exposed to and what they're walking past.
So I'm happy to repeat it. Shauna is asking about, economic stratification, even in urban areas. It also happens, by the way, in rural America. There are parts of our country that don't have the money or enough people to afford to treat the arsenic in their water. So you'll see disparities in clean water. I always say 90% of Americans drink water that meets all federal standards. That means 10% of Americans do not, which is pretty astounding number of people when you consider that we have all the technology we need. So that happens according to income and issues like that. Environmental justice, the whole idea of environmental justice is to ensure that there's not a deliberate citing of facilities or sort of writing off of areas so that other areas can prosper. And I think that there's an executive order was issued by President Clinton, reaffirmed by this president, and we are very much committed to trying to ensure that environmental justice is occurring. But the real challenge is to not just prevent the bad stuff or to go back and deal with concerns after they've happened, which is some of what we find ourselves having to wade through. And it can be very frustrating because it's been, these cases can be very old. But instead, to try to help communities advocate for what it is they want. And I'll just speak really pragmatically. Communities do want jobs. They want economic opportunity and growth. But I have yet to find the community that if you said the price of that job is that your child's going to get sick, that there's going to be more air pollution and you're going to have to deal with that they don't go, hold it. I have a concern with that. And that's a community that's very wealthy or a community that's not. The answer is that it's not yes or no. It's how do I have both? And there really is an opportunity for both. Technology is such that you can build advanced manufacturing and facilities that are not these sources of, horrible pollution, and are sources of economic development and growth. And we don't need to export that pollution, which isn't fair either, and we don't need to, suffer in one community versus another. And we need to go back and clean up the brownfields we've created. So I think EPA has a role there. I also think that communities are becoming, the environmental justice movement has come a long way since the 80s when it formed, where it was very much sort of a let's stop things from happening, and now you'll see communities engaging and saying, and smart companies are doing this, we want to engage with the community early on about what it is we're trying to build and what it is we're trying to do. We want community support because we have now learned that we will never build anything in this country, forget EPA or regulators, without the consent, without a social contract with the community in which we work. And that's about pollution, it's about jobs, it's about economic equality, it can be about job training, it can be about making sure that the people doing the construction come from the community, that the people catering come from the community. You get all those kinds of discussions. I think we've become much more active in that kind of realm as well, and I think it's very good for the country.
And finally, there's a number of questions about going into public service. Would you ever run for office?
I don't know.
Wow. That would be awesome. You should do it. Shouldn't she run for office? Girl, we're going to start the Lisa Jackson campaign for Senate right here. Woo!
Hold it. I just want to say one more time that I do think public service is really important. And I think that I'm always amazed because everywhere I go now, it seems like every person under the age of, say, 30 is not just doing public service, but doing it in all kinds of amazing locales on all kinds of amazing things. Very entrepreneurial work, very hands-on work, people traveling outside the country, traveling to communities. There is a service ethic that's different than even 20 or 25 years ago, and I think it bodes really well. So if government's not your thing, public service, there are lots and lots of opportunities to do that. And I don't think, I know Santa Clara, I know San Jose State's here, I know the schools that are here. That's a big part of your education, and I think it's extraordinarily important to the future of our country.
I do too. I would say, I would echo that 100%, and I would say that no matter where you are in life, at some point, it might be right for you to run for office. And not just public service inside of the government, but to run for office where the policymaking happens. I would totally encourage you to consider yourself as charged with being a member of Congress or a member of a state legislature, because what are you here for if not to leave the world in a better place? Right? And the last thing I will just say is that Nancy Pelosi had a great line. I just heard her speak recently, and she said that when she went to South Africa, she saw a bishop who had a prayer on the wall, and the prayer said, "When I at last see the face of God, he will ask me, show me your scars. And if I have no scars, he will say, was there nothing worth fighting for?" So may you all have plenty of scars at the end, because there's lots to fight for. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
I'd like to close by thanking Lisa again so much for your sharing your passion and your candor. We really appreciate it. And Jennifer, for your masterful job as interviewer. Please, as a small token of our esteem, accept this much coveted Churchill Club speaker T-shirt.
Wow! Check it out! Oh my God, is this nerdy or what?
Thanks again to Microsoft, of course, for hosting this program. The program will be on view on the Churchill Club YouTube channel within the next day or two, so feel free to pass along the word. You have been an amazing audience. Thank you for being here and sharing your views, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Good night.